All right, welcome back. Here we are, starting a new chapter. The first section in this chapter, which is very, related to the last chapter, and the fact that we're continuing with animal systems. But the first system in this chapter has to do with response. And so I thought it would be appropriate to kind of start with a worship thought that I always do in this chapter, because we are animals that respond. One thing that makes humans unique, and I believe created in the image of God, is the ability for us to have the nervous systems that we do, that allow us to think and make wise, intelligent choices, and have memories and have relationships with other people that other animals just don't have that privilege. I mean, they have cool interactions with each other, yes, but humans are very unique. And I want to read a couple Proverbs. Proverbs 16:32 says, "Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." So that verse right there is just telling you, man, you can be mighty and you can take over cities, but having self-control and being able to be slow to anger, and think about what you're going to do before you do it, that's better than someone who can take a city and is powerful. So actually in that verse, it's basically saying that power comes in self-control. Humility is power in God's kingdom. And so another proverb says, "Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense." So it's good sense, good thinking, that makes one slow to anger. So where do we get that thinking? Where do we get that good sense? Again, it comes from our brain, and our brain and the way that God created that. Another proverb: "A man of quick temper acts foolishly, and a man of evil devices is hated." So we don't want quick tempers. There's a whole list of verses here. It's pretty cool. But obviously the Bible spends a lot of time addressing how humans have responded, whether that be from the Garden of Eden and the choices that were made there to the choices that we make now. And a lot of the choices that we make are based on thoughts and memories and ideas that we have in our brain, right? We don't make any motions or movements or any proactive movements from our body, whether that be a muscle movement that is just moving, or whether that be a muscle movement to write something, unless that's coming from some stimulus that is coming our way, or some trigger, I should say, that is producing the response. So it's usually going to be a stimulus that produces a response. And I don't want to get too far into the lecture yet. I just want to highlight this as a worship thought that, hey, since we are such fantastic beings, the way God created us, with the ability to respond and think about our responses, we're held accountable for that, and we're held to a higher responsibility, because we have the ability to think before we act. And so we need to remember that we're made in God's image, and that when His Spirit is within us, not only are we accountable for that, acting not just like animals, but we are actually equipped. We are privileged and equipped with the ability to make those kind of decisions, believe it or not. All right? And so I know we're not perfect, though, so that definitely happens in our lives when we cannot, and we succumb to our own selfishness and have no self-control. But the power is there within us. And so let's keep our eyes focused on God and ask Him for His Spirit daily. I believe that's exactly what gives us that power, and the relationship we have with God is key. And so what is response? Let's quickly just go ahead and go into the lesson here. I love this. Think about it. Let's read this. Imagine that you are a favorite place, or imagine that you're at a favorite place, a beach that's temporarily closed down, or a basketball court that's probably also closed down. Think about how the sun and wind feel on your face and how good it feels to make the perfect layup. Now think about the way you experience that place. You gather information about the surroundings through your senses, such as vision, what you're seeing, hearing, the sounds of the ocean waves. Your nervous system basically collects all of that information, and then your brain decides what to do with that information. It decides how to respond. So again, we don't respond until we first have a stimulus. And the same is true for all animals, though the structures that perform those functions are going to vary from phylum to phylum. And we are so complex, again, made in God's image, and so we can totally make decisions and respond to situations very different than typical just animal behavior. And so I wanted to go back to the top here while we're on this too. You know, I mentioned that, hey, maybe some beaches are closed, maybe some basketball courts are closed, and sports are not happening, whether that be sports you play or sports you watch. And so I know that I'm just going to go away from the PowerPoint here for a second. This is not a worship thought, but this is just a meditation thought to think on, something to think about while you're in this quarantine and about to head into the summer. Again, some of you may be experiencing this harder than others because you were used to playing those games or watching those games or being on that beach and smelling the beach. I love how the beach smells, to be honest with you. The smells of the beach and surfing and that feel, all that's being taken away from you right now. And it's made some people revolt, right? That's why there's a lot of protesters on the streets, and, because people are, they're really struggling with this quarantine. And so just a thought to help you with that, if you're struggling with that, is find new hobbies, find new ways to entertain the five senses that you have. Now, be careful, because we need to be, there's that song, be careful little ears what you hear, be careful little eyes what you see. We want to be careful how we entertain our five senses, because they literally help dictate what we're going to do, right? They really make imprints in our brain. But now is a good time to find healthy ways of entertaining those five senses. Cook new foods you've never cooked before. Really make quarantine a rich experience, because you stimulated your five senses in ways you never did. You listened to songs you've never listened to before, and now you have a new appreciation for jazz when you never did before, or whatever. So think about your nervous system. It does a lot for you. We take it for granted, the senses that we have, and so make sure you're getting outside, you're walking, trying new things, and even you can actually replicate some experiences that you used to maybe love to do. Let's say you don't want to give up certain things like sports. Well, maybe make a new sport, find a new way to compete so that you can entertain competition in a healthy way or whatever. I don't know. Just that's, again, not a worship thought, just something to help you with the quarantine, because we are individuals that detect a lot of stimulus, right? And it's constantly bombarding us. And so how do we respond? How do we respond to those stimuluses? And then we'll also go back into the stimulus again. So when we make a response, it's due to a stimulus, and so we're going to talk about how that happens. Basically, it's through neurons. Neurons are a specialized cell. Remember, our body's made up of cells, all kinds of cells. Every cell has the basic structure with the nucleus and the DNA inside the nucleus, the Golgi apparatus. We studied all that in chapter 7. Well, every cell is the same as far as it having basic organelles and basic and basic structures like the nucleus, of course, that all eukaryote cells have, and having the DNA and the ribosomes that make the proteins. But every cell is going to be different, because every cell is specialized. This happens from birth. When you're first born, you're just a cluster of 2 or 3 or 4 cells, and they've got a lot of work to do. They basically don't have any specialization. Well, they have to specialize into different organs and tissues. I didn't say that in the right order. It actually goes from cells, tissues, to organ systems. So we're quite complex. But as far as the nervous system, when we make responses, when you talk about, we've all heard of nerves. The nerves and your brain and all that make up the nervous system are made of neurons. Neuron is just a specialized cell. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. It's one of my favorite specialized cells. The structure of it's because they look really cool, because it's literally the structure of the neuron that enables it to do what it does. It enables it to receive and pass on information. And so, working together, neurons can acquire information from the surroundings in different ways, depending on how God created the organism. And then it can interpret that information, and then it can decide on what to do about it. And so neurons, they carry information, and they also send information. So neurons are quite complex. And so let's look at the order again. I think number 1 in your assessment has to do with the order. And so the best way to do that is look at this picture. We can skip all this text. But detecting stimulus. Detecting stimulus is where we're going to start. Then we're going to look at how we process that information, and then how do we respond. So it's basically 3 phases. The nervous system works on kind of three distinct phases. And the first phase is detecting stimulus, detecting a stimulus. And it's usually going to be some, again, depends on how you're designed, but for us it's going to be a sight, a sound, a smell, a taste. And there's going to be certain cells that do that, sensing. Like these might just be skin cells, and they're specialized. If they feel pressure, then they'll send a nerve impulse through the nerve to the brain, and the brain will detect it and say ouch, and then it'll make that area hurt. Or it might be something that detects temperature, and it'll say, ooh, that hurts as well, that burns. And so then it sends that signal to your brain, and your brain sends a signal to that cell to make it feel like it's on fire. And so there's a lot of communication going on between neurons, but cells can be specialized in the fact that they're able to pick up those things like temperature or pressure or things like that. And so sensory cells will usually be where those sensory organs are, like your ears, your eyes, like in fact the back of your eye, you have specialized cells that can detect light. All right, it's not nerves. Nerves are not in your eyeball detecting light. There's sensory cells that detect light. Well, then they will send the signal, or they'll tell the neuron to send the signal to the brain to form the image of what you're seeing. And so, first of all, you have sensory cells that can detect information. And usually right next to the sensory cells, you're going to have a very special neuron called a sensory neuron. And that sensory neuron, again, all cells have to have a little nucleus. So you can see the nucleus there with the DNA inside of it. But look at the exotic structure of this neuron. Basically, it has these little like arms and fingers, and that's for communication. So these arms or little fingers here are detecting the stimulus from the sensory cell. Let's say you have a pressure sensory cell here. You get some pressure, and that triggers a response, that triggers a communication between this cell and the sensory neuron. And there's a little synapse here and little chemical reactions that take place. You can study that in biochemistry or anatomy and physiology, but there's chemical reactions that take place in these little gaps between the neurons. And then that will send a signal through the cell, through what's called the axon, and then that nerve impulse will go to the next neuron. And then that neuron will receive through these little dendrites. These little fingers are called dendrites because they receive nerve signals. I know that vocab word's not in your chapter, but I have to use it. Sorry. Dendrites receive information, and axons send out information. But again, dendrites and axons are just part of a nerve cell. They're part of a neuron. And so neurons, again, they have these dendrites and axons, but they still have a nucleus. Now, different neurons can look differently. So the sensory neuron, it has probably more more axons because it needs to send out some signals. It's only got a couple dendrites because, hey, it only needs a couple to attach to the sensory cells, but it needs a lot of axons to send out information because maybe it wants to send out information to this part of the brain or this part of the brain or this part of the brain. And so again, this would and then this would represent the brain, which is made up of interneurons. This is a very simplified image, by the way. There's many more neurons in between. And the brain has thousands, millions of neurons connected to each other. And that's what makes the brain special, is these interneurons. So I really want to give a shout out here, quick shout out to the interneurons, because those interneurons are going to be the ones that form the network of neurons in a brain that allow us to process the information. So we're here now. We've already detected the stimulus through sensory neurons, and now we're at the processing phase where we use interneurons. The interneurons are going to pass the information from one interneuron to the next, to the next, to the next, and in that process, decisions are basically being made. The organism is deciding, do I go here, do I go here, which way do I go? Now, if we were to show all of the interneurons, again, it's millions of them in our brain, so the map would be huge. But if, let's say I have a huge map here, the information could go down and to the left, it could go down to the right, it could go through any possible way through that big, large map. And that would be the process of thinking or deciding of what to do with that signal, because that impulse, that nerve impulse, is like energy. It literally is like electricity. Okay, that's why you can actually stimulate muscles with electricity, and that electricity has to be processed, and it's processed in these interneurons. And once it works its way through the map, let's say it tells the body to the body to move, because hey, that hurt, that pressure hurt, and so I want to move away. So then the interneurons will take that signal and they'll just pass it on through the axons to where they reach the dendrites of another neuron. And then these neurons are special. They're called motor neurons. What they will do is they will take the signal from the interneurons, and then they will send the signal through these axons to muscles that will then contract. And then the muscle contraction will move whatever bones that the tendons that they're connected to are connected to. Muscle connects to tendons and then bones. That's the next section, by the way. And so motor neurons are very special. They're the ones that are going to tell the muscles to do what they do, to contract, and when to contract and how often to contract. But they're not going to do that unless they get a signal from the interneurons. So talk about self-control. If you don't want to grab that cookie in front of you, those motor neurons will not tell your muscles and make your muscles contract to pull on the bones to eat that cookie, to make you move to eat that cookie, if the interneurons don't send that signal. And so what could actually happen is the interneurons could take that signal and just make it die. They could just make it kind of go away. And so maybe the sensory signals are coming in through the sensory neurons, but the interneurons in the brain are just making the information go somewhere else, and definitely not to the motor neurons to move your muscles. All right, that's it. That's the end of the line. It's not really like a circle or a loop or a cycle. It's kind of a one-way stream here. You have, if you're sleeping, not much is going on. But when you're awake, you got all kinds of sensory cells, whether these are cells in your ear, your middle ear bones, or this back of your eyeball, or your fingers. Isn't that interesting? So check that out. Let's talk about touch for a second. If you touch something that's soft versus touch something that's abrasive or rough, then what will happen is these sensory cells have the ability to detect what kind of surface you're touching. And if that's a good soft blanket or something like that, the sensory neuron may send the signal this way to the left. Well, that's going to tell this interneuron, hey, this is a good thing. Let's send a signal to the muscles to keep touching the blanket because it feels good. But or to keep petting the animal because it's soft. But let's say that it was like an abrasive surface and it was like, ow, I don't really like touching this. Or like my brother, for example, it's funny, he has this thing, like there's certain materials he cannot touch. It drives him crazy, just the feeling of that texture of plastic. It's just a smooth plastic too. It's not even rough, but he cannot tolerate it. And it probably has something to do with the neurological system here. The sensory cells detect that certain texture and then will send the signal. Let's call it this pathway here. Well, this pathway means, I hate that. That's what the interneurons are saying. I hate that. Whether that's a learned behavior or that was something he was born with, I don't know. And we all kind of have that, right? We all have a certain substance we don't like touching, or certain things we don't like seeing, or whatever. And again, it's hard to say if that stuff is genetic and we were born with it, or it's learned behavior. But the interneurons will process it as oh, that's a bad thing, right? Maybe even make us experience negative emotions. Basically, sensory neurons are going to detect information. They're going to give them to interneurons, which will process the information. And then a response will be generated when a motor neuron is activated. A motor neuron will be activated only by an interneuron communicating with it, though. Keep that in mind. So that's kind of the sequence. It goes from top down. It goes from top down here. And by the way, this could actually be the muscles right next to the skin cells. They've drawn this map conveniently so it's easy to study, but your brain is up in your head, and these skin cells might be at your fingers over here. Well, so are the muscles at your finger, right? They drew this map in a way that's easy to study it so that you can see the flow from a stimulus all the way to a response. All right. And again, a response is just when it's a reaction to a stimulus. And so if we don't want to be quick to react, like the Bible said, again, remember, it's going to be our inner neurons that are going to stop the flow of circuit so that our motor neurons don't get that information and trigger the muscles to move or whatever. And literally, those could be the muscles that are moving your tongue. Isn't that crazy how just the muscles at your tongue, if you can suppress that action, if you can keep those motor neurons from moving your tongue, you can save yourself probably your life one day. There's a lot of people that have probably lost their lives just because they've said the wrong thing at the wrong time to the wrong person. And so self-control is just something to value more than even being able to take over a city, right? Sorry, I keep going back to that worship thought. Our nervous system is so awesome. It literally allows us to make movements and also experience emotions, and I love our nervous system. That's probably my favorite. So let's look at some trends, though. The book is big on evolution, so they're going to say, what are the trends in the nervous system evolution, like from simple organisms to more complex organisms. By the way, anybody seen an octopus ever do some really cool stuff? Octopus can do some awesome things. They can memorize, like, how to open jars by watching other octopuses do it, and like they can go through mazes, and like they're really, really fantastic in what they can do because of their nervous system. It doesn't mean that they're more complex than us, but they just have a unique nervous system. And so we'll look at all these different complexities. Basically, if we want to start with super simple organisms, we can look at invertebrates. Those are those are animals. We're still in the animal kingdom, but these are these are going to be the phylums that don't have a vertebrate or a backbone or a nerve cord necessarily. Some of them will have a nerve cord, but definitely no backbone. Our nerve cord, remember, sits inside of our backbone. And so let's see. Cnidarians, like you see here, cnidarians, kind of like a jellyfish, they're just going to have a nerve net. No specialization really going on. So you don't have very much inner neurons to do anything, any kind of thinking or anything like that. You just have a big network of neurons. This neuron's connected to that one, which is connected to that one, which is connected to that one, which is connected to that one. And so they're all essentially connected in some way or another to the network. And so, but it's very simple. There's not very much specialization. So cnidarians, such as jellyfish, are going to have those. And basically, the next level up might be like a sea star, again, another invertebrate, that phylum is called Echinodermata or echinoderms. Sea stars, which have like radial symmetry. It means they're symmetrical if you look radially, like in a circle, right? Radially symmetric invertebrates, such as echinoderms, such as sea stars, for example, will have inner neurons grouped together into nerves, or even nerve cords that form a ring around the animal's mouth or stretch out along the arms. So, but that doesn't mean it's specialization. You have more grouping of the nerves. Now, it's still in other invertebrates, you can have a number of interneurons. Remember the thinking neurons that are grouped together into small structures called ganglia. Now, when you have that happening, you have specialization, essentially. And so like an octopus, for example, what makes it interesting is that it has a lot of ganglia. A ganglion is a singular, ganglia is plural. So an octopus having all the different ganglia means that it can do more things, because ganglia is a specialized region where you're going to have a grouping of a whole lot of interneurons, almost like a brain, but not quite. If you do have ganglia at the head, you have something called cephalization. Cephalization, circle that word. Cephalization is something that usually occurs in bilaterally symmetrical animals, so they have a left and a right. They're usually going to exhibit cephalization. What that means is that the interneurons are going to get together in like a ganglia like that, but it's going to be towards like the head. It's going to be like at the top of the organism, the anterior side of the organism. Like here, a flatworm is another good example. Flatworms will have sort of a head. Typically, the largest ganglia are located in the head region, and they're called the cerebral ganglia. So if you have a ganglia that are, and same with this grasshopper, it's got a bunch of ganglia, but if a bunch of ganglia get together to become even more specialized, you can form a brain. And a brain is just like a whole lot of ganglia, basically, a really large region of ganglia together to form a brain. So again, the bigger the network you can make, the more thinking you're going to be able to do, the more processing of the information you're going to be able to do. And so a cricket or an arthropod is a class of animals. Domain, kingdom, phylum, I think phylum is arthropod, and then class would be insects. So insects is a class, arthropods are a phylum. And they have, many of the arthropods will have brains like this, but they'll also have little bitty ganglia here along the body. Now, again, a brain is a structure that's going to have many cerebral ganglia that are organized into a structure, right? And the mollusks will have that, like the octopus, for example. It has ganglia, but it also even has a brain. It has a centralized region of a brain where a lot of ganglia are organized together, and so that's probably where the memory comes from. Octopus have like an extreme ability to memorize things. And so, all right, the organization or the evolution is what the book is saying here is like this, but I'm going to say that this is just kind of the organization of the way God created these animals. These are brains of vertebrates. So back here we were talking about invertebrates, right? But now we're going to start talking about vertebrates, or sometimes they're called chordates. Chordata is a phylum. Remember, domain, kingdom, phylum. We're in the animal kingdom, but the phylum Chordata is in animals that at some point in their life possess a notochord or a nerve cord. And the chordates, they basically have brains that have evolved or been created that have kind of a pattern of development here that you can see. Kind of a progression, I should say, is the word I was looking for. There's a progression of complexity that eventually leads to us, mammals, with a really high complexity. But the smallest level of complexity would be a bony fish. Now, there's like 6 different regions of the brain, though, that we can talk about. And that's what the book is saying here, is if you look at the brain, you can see that there's kind of some similarities. And it looks like the brain is just growing and getting bigger and bigger and more complex. But I would say God just stuck with his design and just designed animals more complex. But you have in this color here the olfactory bulb, which is this color here, and it's going to be like kind of a purple, and that's going to be responsible for smell. Your olfactory bulb in your brain is responsible for smell. And so the olfactory system depends on the organism, but for fish, they don't have a nose, but they have little holes that the water can come through. And fish have actually a very large olfactory bulb because they need to be able to smell their prey from far away. Whereas a mammal, believe it or not, the olfactory bulb is kind of small. I mean, we can still smell things, but it's not super strong. And that's probably because we don't need that, right? But you can see it kind of gets smaller and smaller as you go down from bony fish to amphibians to reptiles to then birds to then mammals. The optic lobe, you guessed it, has to do with optics or vision. That's usually going to be on the back. Here. And so your optic nerve that comes from your eye will send a signal to the optic lobe of your brain, and that's where the image is actually produced. In your brain. So you can actually stimulate images on your brain by triggering these neurons to react in the optic lobe rather than even having to have an eye. An eye is there to detect light, and the cells on the back of your eyeball will detect light and they will tell the brain what wavelength of light that is so that you can see color and shape and all that. But if you were to just stimulate, I should go to the mammal here. If you were to just stimulate and I think that's right here. It's on the back side of your brain, so it's not this region here. That's the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata. But the optic lobe is in the back here. And if you were to stimulate the optic lobe with like a, I don't know, just a wire that has like a small current, so you're not like shocking the individual too much, but you can like open someone's head up and put little electrodes on the back of their brain and trace out letters. You can trace out letters, and the individual, blind people that don't even have vision because their eyes are messed up for whatever reason, they could literally see letters because you're tracing it into their brain. And in fact, I just read an article that's why I'm on this little tangent. I read an article last week of how they're working on doing that right now, and they've been successful in their tests and trials. They were actually able to trace out letters on the back of an organism's brain, and that person was able to trace out with their hand the same letter. Isn't that fantastic? So we could literally like make people see things that aren't even there. It's kind of scary, isn't it? But eventually, at the end of the day, we can create computers that can detect light and then can make those stimuluses more intentional to that optic lobe so that the individual can basically just see whatever around them. But it's kind of scary to think that you have the power to make somebody see something that is not even there, almost like a hallucination. That's another proof that the brain is where vision is. The brain is where vision is, because people see things all the time that are not there. Whether they take medication or they don't sleep or whatever, they hallucinate. And so, but that's an optic lobe region. You can see the evolution goes from very small in the bony fish to quite large in the mammal. Your cerebellum, the blue region, has to do with involuntary muscles and involuntary coordination. Actually, I should take that back. The medulla oblongata controls the functioning of your internal organs without you even having to think about it. Your medulla oblongata, the yellow region, is thought to be like your midbrain or your like the most important part of your brain that used to be very large, because it controlled everything as far as heart rate and lung. You don't have to think about the breath you take. That's because of your medulla oblongata. And it's right next to your cerebellum, which is on the back of your brain. But the cerebellum has to do with coordination and movement, so it's all about voluntary muscle. But the cerebellum, if you get hit in the back of the head, usually in this blue region, your cerebellum gets knocked, you'll go unconscious because you like lose coordination and all that, and you kind of get a little squirrely because your cerebellum has to do with coordinating muscle movements and all that, balance. Finally, we just talked about the medulla oblongata. It controls like your heart rate, breathing in yellow, and green is just your spinal cord. Your brain, the spinal cord in green is going to travel down the backbone, actually, of the chordate. It's going to be your nerve cord, and then it's going to be usually inside of a vertebrate or a backbone so that it's protected. And then it'll branch and branch and branch and branch to different tissues and organs that will receive the signal, whatever that be, organs inside you or your fingers or whatever, muscles. So there you go. There's your evolution. Oh, the most important one. I saved the best for last, but almost skipped it because I forgot. Cerebrum. The cerebrum, which is the kind of the peach colored here, the actual color of your brain. Look how large that is in the mammal. That is going to be the thinking portion of your brain. That's going to be the spot where you have a ton of interneurons communicating with each other. In fact, that's actually where memory is stored and all of that. So like if you damage part of your cerebrum, let's say you damage this part right here. For some individuals, that may be where they held their memory for their 16th birthday or whatever, and that memory won't be there anymore. So memories are stored here in your cerebrum. And then when you receive signal, a nerve impulse, let's say you see something, and that'll come to your brain, and you have memories that will say, hey, that's not good. Remember last time we saw that? And then you'll say, okay, yeah, let's walk away. Or you may see that and go, oh, this is a good thing. That means I'm about to eat because mom's walking in the room. And so that memory being stored in your cerebrum allowed you to process the information. That's why we call it the thinking region, because that's where you're doing all the processing. In fact, to be more specific, the frontal lobe here in the very front of your cerebrum is what does most of the thinking and decision making, and that actually doesn't even fully develop until you're in your 20s. So a lot of times adolescents make bad decisions, as I did when I was an adolescent. At least I'll speak for myself, because my frontal lobe wasn't fully developed. And then if you decide to do any kind of recreational drugs like alcohol or marijuana or anything like that, you actually suppress the growth of this frontal lobe. And so that can lead into your 30s or 40s or out until you stop doing those chemicals. You can actually really hinder your development of your frontal lobe. And that's why people do really crazy things, either when they're intoxicated or even after they've been through years of intoxication and drug use. They'll still make poor decisions because their frontal lobe was never fully developed right. So you want to take care of your brain, especially the frontal lobe. There's a couple lobes missing here, like there's the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe on the side, whatever. So again, this cerebrum is actually broken up into different regions as well. I shouldn't say lobes. In fact, it even has a left half and a right half. You guys know about that, right? The right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. But we won't go into that in this chapter or this course. That would be maybe anatomy and physiology or something like that, where you'd go into different regions of the brain. But as far as the evolution of the brain, we were just going to say, as creationists, that God just created organisms with kind of the same design. He didn't reinvent the wheel. If the wheel rotated, he's going to just create different wheels, different rims, different tires that all look a little bit different but have the same kind of structure. Now, this finally, to end the chapter, we're just going to talk about different sensory systems. God could have designed organisms to have different sensory organs. They could detect anything. Like for example, we can only detect certain wavelengths of light that allow us to see certain color, but there's all kinds of wavelengths out there. There's X-rays, infrared rays, ultraviolet rays, and those don't show up in our brain just because we're not created to detect them. There's wavelengths of sound that we cannot hear, but other organisms, they can hear those sounds. They can hear those frequencies or wavelengths. Wavelength determines frequency. So dogs can hear certain really high-pitched frequencies that humans cannot. There are temperature sensing organisms organs that can detect temperatures that we simply cannot, to very really good precision. And like one of my favorite is the squid eye. Octopus also has one of these complex eyes, and they're as complex as fishes and humans, though their structures differ. So the compound eye is awesome. The complex eye, which is what we have, by the way, it allows us to see in such awesome detail, resolution that you can never get in a camera. A simple squid actually has one of those. Isn't that interesting? That's a complex eye. I was saying the wrong word when I said compound eye. Compound eyes are also actually kind of neat as well. They're actually made up of many, many, many little eyes that will take this shape here. So you have all these little bitty eyes. They're like little different lenses that can detect light from way over here or way over here or way over here. So you have all different kind of sensors detecting light, not just one lens. You have all kinds of lenses but believe it or not, those produce less detailed images. They're less detailed, but they allow you to detect minute little changes in movement. So a mosquito can detect you moving when your partner that's next to you or someone who's standing near you cannot, because a mosquito has a compound eye, but a mosquito can't see like in resolution like you could. And so why is that important or not important? Because the mosquito doesn't need to see a detailed image. It doesn't need to see in a 4K. It just needs to know that you're moving. So there's simple eyes, like on this organism here. This would be a scallop in the ocean. There's like 40 to 60 simple eyes on a scallop that don't even form images at all. They do detect movement, though, well enough to actually enable this scallop to escape its predators. but they don't really form images even at all. And the most simple would be a planarian, which would be like a flatworm, and they basically just have like an eye spot, which is just a group of cells that can detect changes in the amount of light. So it can't really detect light, but it more so detects changes in light, which is probably very similar to the simple eye as well, but the simple eye just has a few more structures like a lens and things like that. But so the way this figure 28.6 works is it's basically showing the kind of the evolution of the eyeball from very simple to the most complex. That would be for the invertebrates, by the way. But we and all vertebrates are usually going to have the complex eye. In fact, the chordates, the vertebrates, also have other sense organs that are pretty unique. For example, here we go. Bats and dolphins, they can find objects in their environment using echoes of their own high frequency sounds. Many fish, amphibians, and reptiles have color vision that is as good as, if not better than humans. Some species, including certain fishes and the duckbill platypus, can even detect weak electrical currents in water. Some animals, such as sharks, they can use that same electric sense to navigate by detecting electric currents in the seawater caused by the Earth's magnetic field, which is moving quite rapidly, by the way. I just read an article this morning about how the Earth's magnetic field, it's always been moving away from the magnetic North Pole. You know, there's a geographic North Pole and a magnetic North Pole, and they're not in the same spot. And the magnetic North Pole is moving a lot further from Canada and towards Siberia or Russia. And it's been doing so, but lately it's been doing so a lot faster, at a faster rate. And so that actually can mess a lot of things up and could even mess up migration patterns of sharks. And so that could be something you'd study. If you were doing a PhD right now and you were fresh out of college and going into biology, you could make that your study, and you could spend 4, 5, 6 years studying migration patterns and correlating it with the movement of the magnetic pole. That would be something you could get your PhD on, and that'd be very valuable research for generations to come. This is pretty cool. Like, I don't know where I read this, but sharks, maybe it's up here. Yeah, sharks can sense one drop of blood in 100 liters of water. 100 liters of water. And although all mammalian ears have the same basic parts, remember, to detect sound, again, bats and dolphins can use their own frequency sounds to use echolocation, and dogs can hear certain frequencies of sound that are way higher pitch than a human could ever hear. That's why they make little whistles called dog whistles that humans don't hear, but as soon as you blow it, the dog's ear goes like that because it probably drives them crazy. Now, there are some chordates, by the way, some vertebrates that have a well, let's say this. There are some chordates that have a nerve cord but don't have a backbone. There's very few of them. Like, they're called non-vertebrate chordates, and they have some specialized sense organs too. In tunicates, there's going to be sensory cells in and on the siphons and other internal surfaces that help control the amount of water passing through the pharynx. Lancelets, which are like little worms, have a cerebral ganglion with a pair of eye spots that detect light. And so if you're wondering what those are, as I was wanting to get a picture, a tunicate, isn't this crazy? It looks like a heart or like an organ that was dropped at the bottom of the ocean. But here in this very diverse marine ecosystem here, obviously, where you can see all the coral and stuff, you can find tunicates, and they have a cord. They are in the phylum Chordata. They, at some point in life, they can possess a nerve cord, and they're animals, but they don't have a vertebrate. But their nerve system can allow the movement of water through this pharynx, pretty complex, in a complex way. So, and then a lancelet, they said it had those eyes, right? I said it had an eye. So a lancelet is kind of it's almost like a fish, but yet without a backbone or any bones. No bones really, but it does have a nerve cord here. And so a notochord or a dorsal nerve cell at the top there. That would be a lancelet. Okay. All right. That's pretty much it for this section. So thank you guys for watching. I appreciate your time and dedication. If you are watching these, hopefully you are, because I would hate to be wasting my time. But if you are reading the book as well and just answering the questions that way, that would be fine. Keep in mind, if you're watching this video, to make sure you watch the heart video and the heart map and the dissection, because there's some stuff in that video that are not in the book. But from here on out, from chapter 28, I'm just going to be referring to the sections that are in the book and kind of operating off of that. So again, thank you. See ya. Bye.